Hey gamers, so Microsoft the other day announced a Halo 1 remake, and it's coming out for, of course, the Xbox consoles, but PS5 as well, which is an insane thing people like even like 5 years ago, but especially like even before that, would never expect to happen because hey, Halo is like the mascot for Microsoft, and Xbox. To see him come over to a different platform is like, what? That's unbelievable. The console wars must be over. In fact, GameStop themselves have declared the console wars are over, although they did also say that it started with like Halo 1 releasing on the original Xbox when it started before that with Sega and Nintendo, but I digress. It was writing on the wall. Since Microsoft has been going on with like a push to put any game really, it started with like a few smaller titles and then it went to like Gears of War. Halo was the last big one, but like these titles were planning to come over to other consoles like PS5, and also it was rumored this game would be announced, for a while now. And you could offer a lot of criticisms towards this remake, the fact that do we really need it after we got the Master Chief Collection, which basically remastered or remade like a lot of games. Also, doesn't it devalue the brand for Xbox and Microsoft, because there's no real competition anymore for Sony, so they basically have a monopoly. All stuff that's been talked about before, including by myself. But something I haven't really seen talked about, even with myself, I have mentioned it a few times, but not as a dedicated video. That being, why hasn't there been a lot of Microsoft games coming over to Switch 1 or Switch 2, compared to PS5 as of late? Because I don't understand what's Microsoft's viewpoint, especially since when they did announce the Halo 1 remake, they actually gave out an interview saying that the Switch 2 was one of their top priorities, which doesn't make sense because it's not announced for Switch 2 at least yet. So I want to just talk about that. So yeah, let's just get right into the video, shall we? So to understand what I mean when I say it doesn't make sense for Microsoft to neglect Nintendo, we need to go back to early on when Microsoft wanted to buy Nintendo and they of course declined back in the SNES days, and then eventually Microsoft bought Rare, which was a big developer for Nintendo, especially during the N64 days. And because of that, Rare couldn't work on games for like the GameCube generation coming up, so their plans for like future games like a Donkey Kong racing game either got canceled or sifted internally. So they kind of had like a little bit of a back and forth, but eventually they became like friendly when Microsoft wanted to do like some handheld games. So they allowed specifically Rare, but also other companies to put games on like the DS, since Microsoft didn't have a handheld at the time, and they still technically don't. They have the Xbox Ally X thing or whatever, but that's like a PC thing. Anyway, my point being, they became eventually friendly, and we saw some, Microsoft games come over to Nintendo consoles, even as far back as the Game Boy Advance, or they helped develop games for those systems. Stuff like Banjo Pilot, the Donkey Kong Country games, Diddy Kong Racing DS, and of course eventually we got the big one, which was Minecraft on Wii U and new Nintendo 3DS. Now Minecraft, came over to all the other platforms as well, but I still viewed it as a pivotal moment for Microsoft and Nintendo's relationship, since it was building for a little while, and we saw that further develop with the Switch 1 generation, the beginning of that, where we saw stuff like Cuphead come over to the Switch. I believe it was like a timed exclusive first for Switch. It was first on Xbox, but then eventually came over to PlayStation after the other two consoles. Also, I believe another game that followed the same path was New Super Lucky's Tale. Basically have the same release strategy. And then we have the Ori games, which are still exclusive to the Switch console, besides of course on Xbox. They're not on PlayStation. And so I always found it very interesting, when we already did have some Microsoft games on like Switch, and even before that, I always found it interesting how a lot of people will refer to this 4-game plan that Microsoft had, which they did mention, but like this 4-game plan to like bring over specific games like Hi-Fi Rush, Sea of Thieves, Pentiment to other consoles, and people were acting like, whoa, this is like the first time Microsoft is doing this. No, it's not, not even for PlayStation stuff, because again, Cuphead did come over to PlayStation eventually before this. So yeah, I just found it very interesting that people were so surprised by this. But this is where I started to see like a little bit of a weird thing come up with Microsoft and Nintendo, because out of those 4 games, I believe 2 of them only came over to the Switch and PlayStation. The two other ones only were on PlayStation, which was Sea of Thieves and Hi-Fi Rush. The other two games came over for both platforms, that being Grounded, which I forgot to mention before, and Pentiment. And I found it really weird, especially because there was data mine stuff for Hi-Fi Rush, which had like a Switch logo. Sure, along with a PlayStation logo one. And it was like rumored heavily that it would be coming over to Switch, and it didn't end up happening. And you would think it would make perfect sense for it to happen. You know, like the style of the game just fits the Switch vibe, in my opinion. Sea of Thieves, you could argue, is too big, you know, for the Switch, so whatever. But Hi-Fi Rush could totally work. It could just have the frame rate or whatever, and it'll be fine. This is where I start to see them kind of shift their priorities over to PlayStation. And we saw this, you know, that this was happening towards the end of the Switch 1 generation, and we've been seeing this more and more with even the Switch 2, with the fact that Indiana Jones, you know, was confirmed to come out to PlayStation like a little bit before it came out for Xbox, and we had no word of a Switch 2 version. Eventually, like a few months ago, we did get word that there was a Switch 2 version happening, coming out in 2026, but it took like a while for us to get news about that officially. Although besides that, there's stuff like Doom The Dark Ages, which was on PS5 and Xbox, no Switch 2 version, even though Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal are on Switch, so okay. There's the fact that the Elder Scrolls Oblivion remake got like shadow drop for both Xbox and PlayStation at the same time, and it's even like gotten more recently a physical version on PS5, but still no word on Switch 2. We also got news of Forza, Gears of War, and now Halo, all coming over to PS5 or already came over to PS5. The biggest three franchises for Microsoft at previous exclusive on Xbox and PC, but you know, for consoles only on Xbox. And again, no Switch 2 version. And I just don't understand why they're kind of neglecting Nintendo. You know, and that's not to say they haven't given us breadcrumbs before nowadays. Like I mentioned before, Indiana Jones did get it confirmed finally for Switch 2 a few months ago. Also, recently we got the announcement for the Fallout 4, like an anniversary edition thing, and that was confirmed the same time, you know, as the announcement for the other consoles, although it's coming out later, but it's coming out on the Switch 2 in 2026. You know, the other consoles get it a little bit earlier, but that's because it's like just an update for like the game that's already available on there. Well, this is like a new port, so okay, but like it was confirmed the same day. But like that's like the bottom of the barrel stuff, and I just don't get it. And I see some people say, oh, you know, Nintendo will announce it themselves another day, you know, in like a Nintendo Direct. Why? We've seen companies make announcements without Nintendo before, even during the start of the Switch 2 generation. Heck, I made like a short recently about a bunch of Nintendo news that happened like out of the blue in like a single day. You know, that had nothing to do with Nintendo. Maybe it was like a canceled Nintendo Direct, but like still, if it was a canceled thing, Nintendo still allowed them to post it on their own, you know, at the same time, without having to wait for another event to happen. So I don't get why they would wait, you know. Another thing I see is like, oh, maybe the hardware is too weak. But you guys need to realize that games nowadays are meant to be scalable, especially since most of them are available on PC, which has a broad range of specs, you know, to the lowest end with like a laptop to the highest end with like a $2,000, you know, setup, you know, with a lot of monitors, you know, like it's meant to be scalable, these games, you know. And also that's not even taking into account that the Switch 2 is pretty powerful, you know. It's like a little bit under a PS5 and a little bit higher than a Series S power level, and these games are coming out on Series S, so the Switch 2 could easily run them, you know. I know there's been some talks about like, oh, the Series S has been having some trouble with like developing games, but like that's still a mandate Microsoft has, you know. Any games that come over to Xbox Series X also need to work on the Series S, you know. So like my point is that it should all work. And I also see some people saying, oh, maybe it's because dev kits haven't been delivered yet. And I think this one is probably the most likely thing, but even then I still don't understand the dev kit thing. We really don't. don't. You know, it's just a rumor thing about that Nintendo is being stingy with dev kits, and they don't want like a flood of games coming over to the Switch 2 all at once, or only like some specific developers that are really close to Nintendo are getting them first and foremost, and then other companies have to wait. But then, if that was the case, Microsoft should have been like one of the first ones, because again, they have a history with Nintendo, like I mentioned before. So it really does seem like Microsoft doesn't want to support Nintendo platforms, which is such a shame. You know, this is like, this is like probably the bottom of the barrel in terms of Microsoft issues. They have way more issues, than this. But like, just coming from a primarily Nintendo player, it is strange to see these games come over to PlayStation and not the Switch 2, when before Microsoft and Nintendo did have a more of a history together. And I don't get the logic behind it. Now, I should also say, maybe eventually this video will be outdated, because they will eventually announce, Microsoft or Nintendo, in a direct. They will be like, hey, the Halo 1 remake is coming out on Switch 2, and maybe we'll also get Hi-Fi Rush on Switch 2, and Sea of Thieves on Switch 2, all of these other games that either maybe couldn't work on Switch 1, even though I think they could have, but still, like, why the timed exclusive thing? But then again, logic doesn't really seem to make sense for Microsoft nowadays. I mean, they raised prices for their console twice for us, and they also raised prices for developer kits for their systems. They've raised prices for Game Pass. So, logic is like throwing out the window for them. But like, still, we also got a report that they want to increase profit margins by like 30% for the Xbox division. And a way to do that is, of course, raising prices, but also to put their games available on as many platforms as possible. So you would think that to do that, you will put that on Nintendo systems. I don't know, man. I just find this very interesting, and I don't get their logic. The only thing I see that's maybe a possibility is the dev kit thing. But even then, we don't know the full details of that. It's all just been rumored. So yeah, I don't know. If you guys have any guesses for why they're not like giving Switch 2 and Switch 1 users their games, let me know in the comments, because I'm really at a loss of words. But I hope you enjoyed this video nonetheless, of me talking about the history with Microsoft and Nintendo and how they were close. And I forgot to even mention this, Microsoft was actually working on some sort of DS version for Halo, back in the day. So this makes even more sense, like what the heck. So yeah, what's going on. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, guys, be sure to like, subscribe, play some Xenoblade, and I'll catch you all next time. Peace. Bye, everyone.